The worst kind of pain is not being hated by someone you know. It is being humiliated by them in front of everyone you thought would protect you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I never thought a family dinner could feel like a courtroom where I was already sentenced before I even spoke a word. That night, I was sitting in my Moterin Lavese dining room in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Chicago, Illinois, surrounded by people who were supposed to feel like family, yet every glance I received felt measured, evaluated, and quietly judgmental. Linda Parker, my mother-in-law, had always had a way of speaking that sounded polite on the surface but carried something sharper underneath, like every sentence was carefully designed to remind me that I was still an outsider in her world. My husband, Daniel Parker, sat beside me, quietly scrolling his phone at moments when I needed him most, avoiding eye contact whenever conversations shifted toward me. I remember noticing that small detail more clearly than anything else that evening, because silence can sometimes speak louder than words in rooms like that. The dinner itself started normally enough, with small talk about work, family updates, and routine things that people say when they are trying to maintain a sense of comfort in a shared space. But I could feel something building underneath it, something subtle that made my instincts tighten even before anything was said directly. Linda had a way of controlling the rhythm of conversations, allowing pauses to stretch just long enough to create discomfort before filling them with her own interpretations of people and situations. When she looked at me that night, it was not with open hostility, but with something far more complicated, something that felt like predetermined judgment wrapped in social grace. I tried to stay composed, focusing on the conversation topics that did not involve me, hoping the evening would pass without tension. But then the shift happened. It was not loud. It was not dramatic at first. It came in the form of a conversation that slowly narrowed its focus until there was no space left to look away. Linda set her fork down gently, wiped her hands with a napkin, and leaned back slightly in her chair, the way people do when they are about to say something they believe carries weight. Her eyes moved toward me, and for a brief moment, the entire room felt quieter, even though no one else had stopped speaking yet. Then she said it. She said that sometimes people make decisions in life that reveal their true priorities, and that her son had clearly made the best decision of his life when he left certain things behind. The words were not shouted. They were delivered with calm certainty, almost like a conclusion that had already been agreed upon long before I was invited into the room. I remember the exact feeling that followed, because it was not anger at first. It was stillness. A kind of internal pause where your mind tries to process whether you actually heard what you think you heard, or whether there is some alternative meaning hidden inside the sentence that makes it less painful. I looked at Daniel at that moment, expecting something, anything, even confusion. But what I saw instead was hesitation, a small shift in posture that avoided direct confrontation with either me or his mother. That silence told me more than the words themselves. Around the table, no one interrupted. No one corrected the statement. No one tried to soften it or redirect the conversation. And in that absence of response, something became clear to me that I had been avoiding acknowledging for a long time. This was not just a casual remark. It was a moment where hierarchy, perception, and acceptance inside this family were being revealed without disguise. He did not respond immediately. He simply stayed still, aware that whatever came next would no longer be about misunderstanding or tone. It would be about whether I was going to remain silent inside a structure that had just made its position on me very clear. After that moment at the dinner table, nothing at the surface level changed immediately, but something fundamental shifted in the way I perceived every interaction that followed. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember sitting through the remainder of that evening feeling as though I was no longer participating in a family gathering, but instead observing a structure that had quietly revealed its internal hierarchy without intending to hide it anymore. Linda Parker continued the conversation as if nothing significant had occurred. She moved on to other topics with ease, discussing routine matters such as upcoming family plans and household updates, but the emotional weight of her earlier words lingered in the space between every sentence. Daniel Parker remained beside me, still quiet, still avoiding direct engagement with what had just been said, and that silence created a distance that felt more significant than any argument could have been. He began to notice how carefully the room maintained its normal rhythm despite the underlying disruption. It was almost as if everyone had agreed, without speaking, that the moment would not be expanded upon, that it would exist as a statement rather than a subject for discussion. When the dinner eventually ended, there was no follow-up conversation about it, no clarification, and no attempt to reframe what had been said. Instead, people simply transitioned into the routine behaviors of cleaning up, preparing to leave, and exchanging polite goodbyes, as if the emotional impact of the earlier statement belonged to a different layer of reality that did not require acknowledgement in practical terms. On the drive home, Daniel kept his attention focused on the road, and the silence between us felt structured rather than accidental. It was the kind of silence that does not ask for explanation because it assumes explanation will not change anything. I remember looking out the window at the passing streetlights and realizing that what had happened was not just an insult delivered in front of others. It was a redefinition of position within a system that I had not fully understood I was part of until that moment. Over the following hours and days, I began replaying the scene repeatedly in my mind, not because I needed to understand the words themselves, but because I was trying to understand why no one corrected them. That absence of correction became more important than the statement itself. It suggested that the structure I was dealing with did not rely on open agreement to function. It relied on passive acceptance, on silence acting as validation, and on emotional discomfort being absorbed rather than challenged. When I attempted to speak to Daniel about it later that night, his response was careful and restrained. He did not deny what was said, but he also did not fully engage with its meaning. Instead, he suggested that family tensions sometimes lead to exaggerated interpretations of statements and that it might be better not to escalate something that could be resolved internally over time. That response created another layer of clarity for me, because it confirmed that the interpretation of events was already being managed through a different lens than my own. In the days that followed, interactions with Linda did not include any reference to the dinner statement. She behaved as if it had been a passing remark with no lasting significance, yet the structure around me felt unchanged in its implications. Every interaction carried the awareness that my position had been defined in a way that was not going to be revisited or clarified through dialogue. And in that realization, I started to understand that the real conflict was not about what had been said at the table, but about whether I had any influence over how meaning itself was being assigned within this family system. In the days following that evening, the atmosphere inside the household did not change in any explicit or openly declared way, but the structure of interaction between everyone involved continued to shift in a direction that felt increasingly irreversible. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember becoming more aware of how silence itself had become a tool of communication rather than the absence of it. After the dinner where Linda Parker made her statement, there was no direct follow-up conversation that addressed what had been said. Instead, communication returned to surface-level normality, but with an underlying restriction that was difficult to ignore once noticed. Conversations were shorter, pauses were longer, and certain topics were avoided entirely without anyone needing to state that they were off limits. Daniel Parker remained consistent in his behavior during this period, maintaining emotional neutrality in most interactions and avoiding any situation that required him to take a clear position between opposing interpretations. That absence of positioning became its own form of communication, because it allowed the existing family structure to remain undisturbed while also leaving my experience of the situation without external validation. Linda Parker continued to behave as though the previous statement had been a momentary expression of opinion rather than a defining declaration. She remained polite in tone during subsequent interactions, but the emotional boundary that had been established at the dinner table did not disappear. Instead, it became embedded in the way I was perceived within every interaction that followed. When I was present, conversations tended to proceed carefully, as if there was an unspoken awareness that certain interpretations had already been decided and did not need to be revisited. Over time, I began to notice that my attempts to reintroduce clarity into the situation were met not with direct disagreement, but with subtle redirection. When I referenced the earlier comment or tried to express how it had affected me, the responses would shift toward general statements about family stress, misunderstandings, or the importance of not overanalyzing emotionally charged moments. These responses did not directly deny my experience, but they reframed it in a way that reduced its structural significance. The effect of this pattern was cumulative. Each time I attempted to engage with the issue, I found that the conversation would move away from specific content and toward general principles that made the original statement harder to anchor in shared reality. As this continued, I began to understand that the most significant aspect of the situation was not the insult itself, but the collective decision not to treat it as something requiring resolution. That decision created a framework in which my reaction became the primary subject of evaluation rather than the statement that caused it. Daniel's role in this dynamic remained particularly important, because he functioned as the emotional intermediary between two interpretations of the same event. He did not reject my perspective outright, but he also did not reinforce it in a way that would challenge the stability of the family structure. Instead, he consistently suggested moderation, paciencia, and the possibility that time would naturally soften the significance of what had been said. This positioning effectively maintained equilibrium, but it also left me without internal support within the system itself. As time passed, I began to realize that the situation was no longer about a single moment of humiliation or disagreement. It had evolved into a sustained environment where meaning was continuously shaped by collective silence rather than direct acknowledgement. In that environment, the original statement made by Linda Parker did not need to be repeated in order to remain influential. Its impact was maintained through the absence of correction, the absence of clarification, and the absence of shared agreement on how it should be understood. And in that absence, I started to recognize that the true boundary being enforced was not between individuals, but between interpretations of reality itself, where only one version of events could remain socially stable without disruption. In the days that followed, the situation reached a stage where the absence of direct confrontation became more significant than any conversation that had actually taken place. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember realizing that the structure surrounding me was no longer responding to isolated events, but instead had settled into a pattern of interpretation that was self-sustaining. The statement made by Linda Parker during that dinner was never repeated in the same form again, yet its effect continued to shape every interaction that occurred afterward. It had become a reference point that did not need to be spoken aloud in order to influence behavior. When I entered shared spaces within the family environment, I could feel a subtle recalibration in tone and attention, as if each interaction was being filtered through an unspoken understanding that my position had already been evaluated and assigned meaning. Daniel Parker continued to function as the emotional stabilizer within this system, maintaining a consistent pattern of avoiding direct engagement with conflict while preserving surface-level harmony. His responses, when they occurred, were measured and cautious, often leaning toward general reassurances rather than addressing specific concerns. Over time, I began to notice that this pattern created a structural imbalance in how reality was being negotiated within the household. My perspective required articulation and explanation in order to be considered, while other interpretations were allowed to exist without needing justification. Linda Parker maintained her usual demeanor in subsequent interactions, continuing to present herself with composed politeness that gave no outward indication of hostility. However, the absence of any acknowledgement regarding the earlier statement reinforced its permanence rather than diminishing it. It became clear that the goal was not to revisit or clarify what had been said, but to allow time and silence to absorb its impact until it no longer required active defense. In conversations involving other family members, I began to observe subtle shifts in how topics were approached. Discussions that previously included me as an equal participant now often bypassed direct engagement, instead moving quickly towards subjects that did not require my input. When I did speak, there was a noticeable tendency for responses to be framed in ways that redirected emotional weight away from the content of my words and toward the broader context of family harmony. These created a consistent dynamic in which expression was possible, but its influence on the overall narrative remained limited. As this continued, I found myself increasingly aware that the situation was no longer defined by a single moment of confrontation, but by an ongoing process of interpretation management. The original statement that initiated this shift had effectively transitioned from an event into a framework. It no longer functioned as something that could be debated or resolved through discussion, but instead operated as an underlying assumption that shaped all subsequent interaction. Daniel's role in this process remained unchanged, but its implications became more pronounced over time. His consistent neutrality ensured that no additional tension was introduced into the system, but it also meant that no corrective balance was established to counter the existing narrative structure. These left me in a position where direct engagement with the issue required me to operate outside the interpretive consensus of the household itself. I began to understand that what I was experiencing was not simply disagreement, but a form of structural reinforcement where repeated silence served to stabilize a particular version of events. In that environment, the absence of open conflict did not indicate resolution. Instead, it indicated consolidation. The meaning of what had occurred was being gradually fixed into place through repetition of avoidance rather than confrontation. And as I observed this process unfold, I became increasingly aware that the central question was no longer whether what was said was fair or accurate, but whether there was any space within the system for an alternative interpretation to exist without being absorbed into the existing framework of silence and acceptance. As time progressed, the situation surrounding Linda Parker's statement continued to evolve in a way that felt less like a series of separate interactions and more like a stable environment with its own internal rules of interpretation. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember reaching a point where I began to understand that nothing in this environment was being left undefined. Even silence had become structured, and even absence of discussion carried meaning that reinforced the existing narrative rather than weakening it. In the days following the earlier shifts in communication, I noticed that my presence within conversations no longer triggered open disagreement or discussion, but instead subtle adjustments in tone and subject matter that redirected attention away from anything that could challenge the established interpretation. When I spoke, my words were acknowledged in a polite and controlled manner, but they rarely influenced the direction of the conversation in a meaningful way. Instead, responses tended to smooth over or generalize what I had said, placing it into broader categories of family harmony or emotional sensitivity rather than addressing its specific content. Daniel Parker continued to occupy the same position within this structure, maintaining emotional neutrality and avoiding any clear alignment that would disrupt the balance already in place. His behavior remained consistent, but over time I began to see that consistency itself was part of what stabilized the system. By not introducing contradiction, he allowed the existing interpretation of events to remain unchallenged, which meant that the framework established after the dinner incident continued to operate without interruption. Linda Parker's role within this dynamic also remained unchanged in outward appearance. She continued to interact in a composed and socially appropriate manner, but the absence of any acknowledgement regarding the earlier statement ensured that its influence persisted without needing reinforcement. He began to recognize that the power of that moment did not depend on repetition, but on the lack of reversal. Nothing had been said to undo it, and because of that, it continued to define the boundaries of perception within the household. As the days passed, I found myself observing how communication patterns adjusted automatically whenever the topic of family roles or relationships approached sensitive areas. Conversations would naturally shift away before reaching any point where direct contradiction might occur. This created an environment where disagreement did not need to be expressed openly in order to exist, because the structure itself guided conversation away from potential conflict. I began to understand that what I was experiencing was not simply social discomfort, but a system of reinforcement built on selective engagement and controlled omission. The most significant realization during this period was that the original statement made by Linda Parker had transitioned fully from a moment of speech into a permanent interpretive lens. It no longer existed as an isolated event that could be contextualized or reframed through discussion. Instead, it functioned as a reference point that silently influenced how every interaction involving me was processed. Daniel's continued neutrality ensured that no counterbalance emerged within the system, which meant that the interpretation had no internal resistance. In practical terms, this created a situation where the absence of explicit agreement did not weaken the narrative but instead allowed it to remain stable without challenge. Over time, I became increasingly aware that my attempts to engage with the situation directly were no longer entering a neutral space of discussion, but rather a pre-structured environment where outcomes were shaped before dialogue fully unfolded. This realization shifted my understanding of the conflict itself. It was no longer centered on the content of what had been said, but on the mechanisms by which meaning was maintained without needing continual validation. And within that mechanism, I began to see that the most defining factor was not what was spoken, but what consistently remained unspoken, yet fully active in shaping every interaction that followed. By the time the situation reached a more settled phase in the days that followed, I began to recognize that the environment I was operating within had fully transitioned from a moment of conflict into a sustained structure of interpretation that no longer required active reinforcement to remain intact. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember how the absence of new events did not reduce the intensity of what had occurred, but instead allowed it to become embedded more deeply into the way every interaction was processed and understood. The statement made by Linda Parker during that dinner, which had initially felt like a singular moment of emotional impact, had now evolved into a permanent reference point that shaped behavior without needing to be repeated or discussed. Within the household dynamic, communication continued to follow patterns that were increasingly predictable. Conversations remained polite and functional on the surface, but the underlying structure of meaning had become fixed in a way that subtly influenced every exchange. When I spoke, I noticed that responses often arrived pre-framed, as if the interpretation of my words had already been determined before I had fully finished expressing them. Daniel Parker maintained his consistent position of emotional neutrality throughout this period. He did not introduce new conflict, nor did he actively challenge the existing interpretation that had formed around the original incident. Instead, his presence functioned as a stabilizing element within the system, allowing the established narrative to remain uninterrupted. Over time, I began to understand that this form of neutrality was not passive in effect, but structurally significant, because it ensured that no alternative framing of events was actively supported within the family environment. Linda Parker continued to interact in a manner that preserved social normality while simultaneously reinforcing the underlying hierarchy that had been revealed during the earlier confrontation. There was no need for her to revisit the original statement, because its impact was already sustained through the absence of contradiction. I found myself observing how this absence functioned as a mechanism of continuity, allowing meaning to persist without requiring repetition. In conversations with other family members, I noticed a consistent pattern of avoidance whenever topics approached areas that could potentially reopen the interpretation of that earlier moment. The conversation would naturally shift, often smoothly and without visible tension, toward subjects that maintained emotional stability within the group. These created an environment where the boundaries of acceptable discussion were not explicitly stated, but were clearly understood through repetition and behavioral adjustment. As this pattern continued, I became increasingly aware that my position within the system was being maintained not through direct opposition, but through structured absence of validation. My perspective existed, but it was not integrated into the shared interpretive framework that guided family interaction. Instead, it remained adjacent to it, acknowledged in form but not in influence. Daniel's role in sustaining this condition became more apparent over time, as his consistent refusal to engage in evaluative discussion meant that the system never encountered internal contradiction strong enough to alter its direction. Linda's initial statement, though no longer spoken, continued to function as a foundational reference that required no repetition because its meaning had already been absorbed into the structure of perception itself. I began to realize that what I was witnessing was not a series of isolated social interactions, but a stabilized interpretive system that maintained coherence through selective reinforcement and controlled omission. Within that system, the absence of challenge was not neutral, but actively formative, shaping the boundaries of what could be collectively recognized as relevant or significant. And as I continued to move through this environment, I understood more clearly that the most important factor was no longer what had been said at the beginning, but how permanently its meaning had been allowed to settle without ever being redefined. As the situation continued to evolve over time, I began to understand that what I was experiencing was no longer a sequence of interpersonal reactions, but a fully stabilized interpretive environment that had reached a point of self-maintenance without requiring active reinforcement from any single event or statement. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember reaching a stage where the emotional weight of the original dinner incident no longer felt like something that was unfolding in the present, but instead felt like a fixed reference point that had already been absorbed into the structure of how everyone around me understood the situation. Within the household, interactions continued to appear normal on the surface, but the underlying meaning of those interactions had become increasingly rigid and predefined. Conversations were still polite, still structured around daily life and routine matters, yet there was a consistent absence of any engagement with the deeper implications of what had occurred. When topics approached areas that could potentially challenge the existing interpretation, they were gently redirected or softened in a way that preserved overall stability without acknowledging the underlying tension. Daniel Parker remained in his consistent role throughout this period, maintaining emotional restraint and avoiding any direct engagement that could disrupt the equilibrium that had formed. His responses continued to favor general reassurance and non-confrontational language, which allowed the system to maintain its current structure without internal contradiction. I began to recognize that this form of stability was not neutral in effect, but actively contributive to the persistence of the existing narrative, because it ensured that no alternative framing was introduced with enough strength to alter the shared understanding of events. Linda Parker's presence within this dynamic remained socially composed, and there was no return to the original statement in explicit terms. However, its influence continued to manifest indirectly through the way interactions were shaped and filtered. The absence of correction or clarification had become more significant than any repetition could have been, because it allowed the interpretation of that moment to remain permanently embedded within the family structure. Over time, I observed that my attempts to engage with the situation on a direct level were increasingly met with responses that emphasized emotional generalization rather than factual engagement. When I referenced specific experiences or tried to revisit the meaning of what had been said, the conversation would naturally shift toward broader themes such as maintaining peace, avoiding unnecessary conflict, or preserving long-term family unity. These reframes did not directly deny my perspective, but they effectively removed it from the central structure of shared interpretation. As this pattern continued, I began to see that the most important element of the situation was not the content of the original statement, but the mechanism by which it had been allowed to define context without resistance. In that mechanism, silence functioned as reinforcement, neutrality functioned as stabilization, and avoidance functioned as continuity. Daniel's continued position within this structure ensured that no internal correction emerged from within the system itself, which meant that the interpretive framework remained consistent over time. Linda's role, although less verbally active in later stages, continued to influence the environment through the permanence of her earlier statement, which had effectively become part of the household's unspoken reference system. I realized that what I was navigating was no longer a dispute that could be resolved through conversation, but a stable structure of meaning that operated independently of ongoing dialogue. Within that structure, what mattered most was not what was actively being said, but what had already been accepted as implicitly unchangeable. And as I moved further into that realization, I understood that the central tension was no longer between individuals, but between competing systems of interpretation that determined whether an experience could be redefined or whether it would remain permanently fixed within the framework of collective perception. As time moved forward, I began to realize that the situation I was living through had reached a point where it no longer behaved like a changing conflict, but instead operated as a stable interpretive structure that continued to function without requiring active reinforcement from new events. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember noticing that even when nothing new was happening on the surface, the meaning of what had already happened continued to deepen and harden in ways that were not dependent on ongoing conversation. Within the household environment of Linda Parker and Daniel Parker, interactions had settled into a predictable rhythm that avoided direct confrontation while preserving the underlying interpretation that had formed around the original dinner statement. Conversations remained polite and structured around daily routines, but there was a noticeable absence of any engagement with the foundational moment that had altered my position within the family system. That absence itself had become meaningful, because it indicated that the interpretation of events had already been finalized within the shared environment, even if it was never explicitly acknowledged in those terms. Daniel continued to maintain his consistent behavioral pattern of emotional neutrality, avoiding any action or statement that could be interpreted as taking a definitive position. This neutrality, while appearing calm and stabilizing on the surface, functioned as a reinforcing mechanism for the existing structure, because it prevented the introduction of any internal contradiction that might have altered the established interpretation. Linda Parker, in turn, remained socially composed and continued to engage in routine interactions without revisiting the earlier statement that had initiated the shift in dynamics. However, the absence of any correction or clarification ensured that its influence remained intact, not as an active topic of discussion, but as a permanent contextual layer beneath all subsequent interactions. Over time, I became increasingly aware that attempts to address the situation directly were absorbed into a broader framework that reframed specific concerns as general emotional sensitivity or as disruptions to family harmony. When I tried to reference the original statement or its implications, the responses I received consistently redirected the focus away from factual content and toward the importance of maintaining stability within the household. These responses did not explicitly deny my perspective, but they functioned in a way that reduced its structural relevance within the conversation. As this pattern continued, I began to understand that the most significant aspect of the situation was not the presence of disagreement, but the absence of any shared mechanism for reinterpreting what had already been collectively accepted as established meaning. In that environment, silence was not neutral. It acted as reinforcement. Avoidance was not passive. It acted as structure. And neutrality was not absence of influence. It acted as preservation of the existing interpretive hierarchy. Daniel's continued position ensured that no internal corrective force emerged from within the system, while Linda's initial statement remained embedded as a foundational reference point that shaped perception without requiring repetition. He began to see that what I was experiencing was not a series of interpersonal misunderstandings, but a complete interpretive ecosystem in which meaning was maintained through repetition of behavior rather than explanation. Within that ecosystem, the original moment that defined my perceived role in the family had become irreversible not because it was continuously asserted, but because it was never allowed to be meaningfully challenged. And as I observed this structure more clearly, I understood that the true boundary I was facing was not between agreement and disagreement, but between a system that preserves meaning through silence and a perspective that requires acknowledgement in order to exist within shared reality. In the final stage of what had now become a fully stabilized interpretive environment, I began to understand that nothing about the situation was going to resolve itself through additional dialogue or emotional clarification, because the structure I was operating within had already completed its internal process of defining meaning and assigning permanence to interpretation. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I remember reaching a point where I no longer expected the situation to shift in response to new input, because the system around me was no longer reacting to individual events, but instead preserving a pre-established narrative framework that continued to function independently of ongoing conversation. Within the household of Linda Parker and Daniel Parker, interactions had become fully procedural in nature, maintaining outward normality while remaining internally constrained by interpretations that had already been established and reinforced over time. There were no longer any active discussions about the original dinner statement, yet its influence remained embedded in every interaction through consistent behavioral patterns that avoided contradiction or re-examination. Daniel continued to operate within his established role of emotional neutrality, maintaining stability by not introducing any form of interpretive challenge that could disrupt the existing structure. His silence, which had once felt like hesitation, now revealed itself as a consistent form of system preservation, ensuring that the household narrative remained uninterrupted and internally coherent. Linda Parker also continued her normal patterns of interaction, and while she no longer referenced the original statement directly, the absence of any correction ensured that its interpretive effect remained fully intact. Over time, I came to understand that what I had been experiencing was not a sequence of social misunderstandings or isolated emotional conflicts, but rather a complete interpretive system that maintained itself through selective acknowledgement and controlled omission. Within this system, meaning was not negotiated in real time, but rather stabilized through repetition of behavior and absence of contradiction. Every interaction I participated in was filtered through this framework, which meant that my attempts to introduce alternative interpretations were consistently absorbed and reframed before they could influence the shared narrative. As I observed this pattern over an extended period, I began to recognize that the original moment of humiliation or dismissal had ceased to function as an active event and had instead become a permanent structural reference point within the family dynamic. It no longer required repetition because it had already been fully integrated into the way I was perceived and positioned within the system. Daniel's continued neutrality ensured that no internal recalibration occurred, while Linda's lack of revision preserved the original interpretation without needing to actively maintain it. This combination created a closed interpretive loop in which meaning was continuously reinforced without explicit reinforcement. In that environment, I realized that resolution was not something that would emerge naturally over time, because time itself was not altering the structure. Instead, time was simply allowing the structure to stabilize more completely. The most significant realization came when I understood that my experience within this system was not defined by the content of what had been said, but by the inability of the system to accommodate reinterpretation once meaning had been collectively stabilized. Within that limitation, the boundary between participation and exclusion was not enforced through direct action, but through the absence of mechanisms that allowed for alternative understanding to take hold. And as I reached the end of this realization, I understood that the true outcome of everything I had experienced was not a moment of confrontation or resolution, but the recognition that some systems do not change through dialogue, because their primary function is not to discover truth, but to preserve the version of truth they have already accepted.